What if I told you that one of the most powerful warnings against tyranny wasn't written by a conservative, an economist, or a politician, but by a man who considered himself a democratic socialist? George Orwell fought against fascism during the Spanish Civil War. He believed deeply in justice, equality, and human dignity. Yet after witnessing firsthand how revolutionary ideals could be transformed into oppression, he wrote a short novel about talking animals that became one of the greatest political allegories ever written. Animal Farm isn't really about pigs. It's about power. It's about propaganda. It's about the corrupting nature of unchecked authority. And perhaps most importantly, it's about how ordinary people can lose their freedom gradually, often without realizing it's happening. When Animal Farm was published in 1945, the world had just emerged from the horrors of World War II. Nazi Germany had fallen, but another totalitarian empire stood stronger than ever: the Soviet Union. Many intellectuals in Europe and America still viewed Joseph Stalin as a heroic leader who had defeated Hitler and represented the future of humanity. Orwell saw something different. He saw that beneath the promises of equality and liberation lay another form of tyranny, one that often disguised itself behind noble slogans. Rather than writing a political essay, he chose to tell a simple story. On the surface, it's about farm animals overthrowing their abusive owner. But underneath that simplicity lies one of the sharpest critiques ever written about political power and the tragic fate of revolutions that concentrate authority in the hands of a few. The story begins with hope. The animals dream of freedom. They dream of a society where no one exploits anyone else, where everyone shares equally in the fruits of their labor, and where justice replaces oppression. These are noble aspirations. History shows us that nearly every revolution begins with similar promises. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Russian Revolution promised peace, land, and bread. The Chinese Revolution promised justice for workers and peasants. In every case, millions believed they were building a better future. Orwell understood something profoundly important. The greatest danger is often not oppression itself, but the belief that because a movement begins with good intentions, it cannot become oppressive. Old Major, the elderly pig whose speech inspires the rebellion, represents the revolutionary ideals that fueled Marxism. His dream is one of equality and liberation. But after his death, those ideals are inherited by new leaders, who begin interpreting them according to their own interests. Napoleon, one of the pigs, gradually consolidates power until he becomes an unquestioned ruler. He eliminates his rivals, rewrites history, manipulates language, and builds a cult of personality around himself. The parallels with Joseph Stalin are unmistakable. Snowball reflects Leon Trotsky, who was eventually expelled from the Soviet Union and later assassinated on Stalin's orders. The fierce dogs raised by Napoleon symbolize the secret police used to silence dissent. The sheep, endlessly repeating political slogans, represent citizens conditioned to replace critical thinking with blind repetition. And Boxer, perhaps the most heartbreaking character in the novel, embodies the loyal working class that sacrifices everything for a regime that ultimately betrays it. Boxer believes with absolute sincerity that hard work will create a better society. Whenever difficulties arise, he simply repeats, "I will work harder." Later, another phrase defines his worldview: Napoleon is always right. Orwell wasn't mocking loyalty or dedication. He was exposing the danger of surrendering independent judgment. Boxer never questions authority, because he genuinely believes those in power must know better than he does. Tragically, when he grows old and can no longer work, the regime he served faithfully sends him to the slaughterhouse in exchange for money. The revolution that promised dignity for workers ends by exploiting its most devoted supporter. History offers painful echoes of this tragedy. Millions who believed they were building a workers' paradise became victims of forced labor camps, political purges, artificial famines, and state repression. Many of them never imagined that the revolution they supported would one day consume them. One of Orwell's greatest insights is that tyranny rarely arrives wearing the face of evil. More often, it arrives wearing the face of virtue. Every expansion of power is justified as necessary for security, equality, justice, or the common good. Step by step, extraordinary powers become ordinary. Temporary measures become permanent institutions. Citizens slowly adapt to restrictions they would have rejected only a few years earlier. Freedom usually doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes gradually, almost invisibly, until one day people wake up living under rules they never consciously agreed to accept. This is precisely where Orwell's warnings intersect with the ideas of economist and philosopher Friedrich Hayek. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek argued that central economic planning inevitably requires central political authority. If the government controls production, distribution, employment, and prices, it must also decide who receives resources, whose interests take priority, and who must sacrifice for the collective plan. Such decisions cannot remain purely economic because they involve conflicting human desires. Eventually, coercion becomes necessary. As Hayek famously warned, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. A society that gradually transfers decisions from individuals to bureaucracies inevitably transfers power as well. Orwell illustrated this process through fiction. Hayek explained its institutional logic. Ludwig von Mises reached a similar conclusion through economics. Decades before Orwell published Animal Farm, Mises argued that socialism faced an insurmountable problem, known as the economic calculation problem. Without private ownership of the means of production, and without genuine market prices, governments lose the information necessary to allocate resources efficiently. Prices are not arbitrary numbers. They communicate knowledge scattered across millions of individual decisions. Remove that system, and economic planning becomes guesswork. Shortages become common. Waste becomes inevitable. Production slows. Living standards decline. Political leaders then face growing public dissatisfaction. Rather than admitting that centralized planning itself is failing, they often respond by demanding even greater control. More regulations, more censorship, more surveillance, more punishment for those blamed as enemies of progress. Economic centralization and political centralization reinforce each other until society becomes trapped in a cycle of increasing authoritarianism. Roger Scruton approached the problem from a different perspective. He believed that totalitarian ideologies begin by attacking the moral and cultural foundations that allow free societies to exist. Traditions, families, religious institutions, private associations, and local communities create loyalties that exist independently of political power. For authoritarian governments, such independent institutions become obstacles because they limit the state's influence over individuals. Scruton repeatedly argued that freedom depends not merely on elections or constitutions, but on a culture that values personal responsibility, voluntary cooperation, and respect for inherited institutions. When every aspect of life becomes politicized, citizens gradually stop looking to one another for solutions and begin looking only to the state. Perhaps no aspect of Animal Farm captures this process more brilliantly than Orwell's treatment of language itself. Throughout the novel, the famous 7 commandments painted on the barn wall are quietly altered whenever they become inconvenient for those in power. Historical events are rewritten. Failed policies become glorious victories. Enemies become allies overnight. Facts change, but citizens are expected to pretend they have always been true. Eventually, the animals accept the absurd statement, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." The sentence is logically impossible. Equality cannot have degrees. Yet after years of propaganda, no one questions it anymore. Orwell understood that before governments control people's actions, they often seek to control the words people use and the ideas they are allowed to express. If language becomes corrupted, truth itself becomes unstable. And once truth becomes negotiable, freedom becomes increasingly difficult to defend. This lesson extends far beyond the Soviet Union. Orwell wasn't writing a history book. He was describing permanent features of human nature. Every generation faces the temptation to believe that concentrating power in the hands of enlightened leaders will solve society's problems. Every era produces voices, claiming that liberty must temporarily yield to efficiency, security, or justice. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that power rarely remains temporary once acquired. Those who govern often discover countless reasons why extraordinary authority should continue indefinitely. The final scene of Animal Farm remains one of the most haunting endings in modern literature. The animals gather outside the farmhouse and look through the window. Inside, the pigs now wear human clothes. They dine with the very humans they once denounced as oppressors. They laugh together. They negotiate together. They resemble each other in every meaningful way. Then Orwell delivers one of literature's most unforgettable lines. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which.